Number 19. Benjamin Green and Natalie Ortiz. One day during the summer of 2022, Benjamin Green and Natalie Ortiz got into a fight with a fellow motorist in Harris County, Texas. They decided to follow the driver, who had his young nephew in the car, until he finally pulled over. Green then allegedly got out of his truck and confronted the man, who tried leaving the scene as Ortiz fired a gun into the back window of his vehicle. Disturbing footage of the interaction shows what looks like Ortiz firing 2 shots before she and Green left the scene. One of the bullets grazed the victim's head, but he luckily survived with minor injuries. The child in his back seat was hit by shattered glass, but was also not seriously injured. The other bullet struck a nearby car dealership. Luckily, nobody there was harmed either. Ortiz was charged with aggravated assault, while Green currently faces an assault charge. At her first court appearance, Ortiz blamed the other driver for starting the altercation and claimed she was afraid for her safety after the victim's car almost hit hers. The case is still ongoing. In a more recent example of road rage that led to gunfire, shots broke out between 2 parties in Denver, Colorado's Goldsmith neighborhood. One unlucky driver got caught between the shooters while their dashcam was rolling. In the video, a dark SUV and a white pickup truck were seen weaving in and out of traffic as the pickup tried to get away from the SUV. After passing through a busy intersection, someone in the SUV fired a few gunshots towards the pickup truck in front of them, causing the driver to swerve into the oncoming lane of traffic as he tried avoiding the shooter. The shots kept coming as the truck continued driving toward oncoming traffic to avoid bullets. Thankfully, the confrontation ended without anyone getting hurt. Shortly after this incident happened in May 2023, police reached out to the public for help identifying the drivers. Investigators were troubled and wanted to learn more about what led up to a gun getting pulled out. They even noted that tipsters could be eligible to receive a cash reward, but nobody seems to be in the mood to cough any information up. The story has gone quiet, and it seems as if the drivers are still unidentified. Road rage can easily turn deadly, and while our first instinct is often to react in an aggressive manner, this usually isn't the smart thing to do. Number 18. The murder of Scott Roberts. In a terrifying act of violence captured by a doorbell camera, 66-year-old Jeffrey Roberts drove from Long Beach, California to his brother Scott's house in North Ogden, Utah before gunning down his sibling in cold blood. Scott and his wife Jody were peacefully eating dinner when Jeffrey randomly showed up at their front door. When Scott answered, Jeffrey simply said, "What's up?" Scott replied, obviously confused by the visit, "What are you doing?" Jeffrey asked if their mother was there, and Scott said she was in Missouri and had been there for over a year. Suddenly, Jeffrey decided to pull a gun from inside his jacket and fired at Scott about 8 times. Before dying from his injuries, Scott yelled out to Jody, telling her to run. She was shot that day but survived her injuries. At least one neighbor called 911 and reported hearing the gunfire. In the call's recording, he was heard saying that there was a man and a van in the Roberts driveway that he didn't recognize. He seemed unsure of whether he heard actual gunshots, but he asked if the police would at least drive by to check the situation out. Responding officers met continued gunfire with an outright refusal to cooperate from Jeffrey when they got to the scene. He then used road flares to light the house on fire. In the doorbell camera's footage, he could be seen coming and going from the house before leaving for a final time, with all the smoke alarms blaring. With no other choice, officers returned fire and killed Jeffrey. Any hope of learning what his motive behind the shooting was died with him. A family friend told ABC7 that family estrangement was a major factor in the tragedy, and that others allegedly pushed Jeffrey to his breaking point. She unfortunately didn't go into detail on what that could have meant, so we can only speculate. Number 17. Harrowing hostage rescues. In October 2021, all hell broke loose in downtown Los Angeles when police responded to reports of a man with a gun. They met a suspect who repeatedly shot at a group of civilians. A teenager was barely grazed by a bullet and was expected to recover, and thankfully nobody else was caught in the crossfire. But the day's chaos was just getting started. The suspect, who was later identified as 45-year-old Rudy Anderson, also tried to carjack a vehicle. The woman behind the wheel managed to lock her doors in time and drive away safely. Anderson then shoved someone off a bike and also tried to steal that, but ultimately ran away with empty hands. When he noticed that the police were catching on to him, he went inside an apartment building. Police followed him inside, where he entered a woman's home and held her hostage at gunpoint. He then barricaded the front door and placed the victim in front of a window, where he continued to hold a gun over her head. As soon as a SWAT team forced their way into the apartment, gunfire rang out. Anderson was fatally shot during the exchange of bullets, and the hostage escaped without any injuries. Harrowing body cam footage showed the woman crawling away from Anderson as the SWAT team busted into the apartment. The terrifying series of events was also captured by surveillance cameras and witnesses' cell phones. When the story first broke out, the investigation was still ongoing. Anderson's motive for the deadly crime spree remains unclear, but it's probably safe to assume he was mentally unstable and not getting the help he needed for it. In another jarring hostage situation captured on camera back in 2016, an armed thief went into a Jacksonville, Florida credit union building and held everyone inside hostage for multiple hours. His approach to the robbery was very strange. Later identified as Nicholas Humphrey, the man pretended to be blind and had what seemed to be a service dog with him. Out of nowhere, he pulled a gun and ordered everyone to gather into a nearby room. Humphrey seemed noticeably nervous after the police became involved, as if he was just then realizing the gravity of what he was doing. But instead of surrendering and giving up, he continued to impose orders upon his hostages by making them walk in lines and on their knees. He also threatened to kill the hostages if they didn't listen to him. The scary but strange situation got even worse when Humphrey started making demands to negotiators. He asked for several of his family members, though it's not entirely clear why. Jacksonville Sheriff Mike Williams believed that mental health issues may have played a role, which is a fair assessment to make considering what happened. After all, nobody who robs a bank is 100% sane. At multiple points throughout the surveillance footage that day, customers and employees could be seen sneaking out of the bank, including one person who fell on their way and still managed to get out. Humphrey eventually surrendered to law enforcement and got on the ground with his hands over his head while a SWAT team moved in on the bank. He was taken into custody without incident and charged with 13 separate counts of kidnapping. For over 2 years, court proceedings centered mainly around Humphrey's mental health. He was found unfit to stand trial 4 times before finally being declared competent in 2019. According to state prison records, he's now serving a 15-year sentence for 8 counts of kidnapping. He's set to be released in 2031. Number 16. Out of control cop crush. Sometime in 2018, an officer with the West Wyoming Police Department in Pennsylvania started to get an unwanted barrage of social media messages from a random civilian. It eventually became an everyday thing, reaching a point where the police chief made the young woman, who was later identified as Ashley Keister, sign an agreement specifically promising to leave the officer she was bothering alone. Police Chief Kurt Nocera told the press that the woman's crush on the man became so problematic that she was sending him over 20 messages per day. Just hours after being told to stop, she allegedly called 911 and said she was heading to the police department to look for the officer. Surveillance footage from the next morning showed a woman who looked like Keister pounding hard on the station's windows with her fists. When she failed to get inside the building without being destructive, she took an ashtray and smashed through one of the windows. Officers at the station found Keister rummaging through file cabinets. When they tried taking her into custody, she allegedly started to swing at them. A pair of officers managed to get her under control and placed her under arrest on suspicion of aggravated assault, harassment, and criminal mischief. Number 15. The Disappearance of Dalekerstetter. Usually having surveillance footage makes crimes much easier to solve. In the case of 50-year-old Dalekerstetter from Bradford, Pennsylvania, though, it only led to more questions. Kerstetter was a creature of habit in every sense of the word. He had worked as a security guard and maintenance man at the Corning Glassworks factory for almost 30 years, when he suddenly vanished during the graveyard shift one night back in 1987. Nobody seemed to realize Dale was even missing until the first shift security guard, John Lindquist, came to take over for him in the morning. Dale's truck was found abandoned in the parking lot just a few hours later. The keys were still in the ignition, and several of Dale's personal belongings had been left behind. Police canines traced the missing man's scent back to the plant's furnace, which held expensive platinum pipes. Investigators soon started to suspect Dale had been involved in foul play. Perhaps he had co-conspired with some criminals. Along with Dale himself, $250,000 worth of the pipe had disappeared overnight. He wouldn't have normally gone near the furnace during his shift, so it was strange that the tracker dogs found his scent there. Surveillance footage from the factory's camera showed many disturbing sights from that night. One video showed a masked man creepily lurking in the back of the plant. Dale could be seen greeting the man, leading to the immediate suspicion that he may have disappeared voluntarily while cashing in on his profits from the stolen platinum piping. But it was pretty hard to tell based on the footage whether Dale was actually under duress or not. As he led the man through the building, he stared directly at one of the security cameras. Some investigators perceived this as an unspoken cry for help, while others interpreted it as an insult, as if to say, "Watch me rob your factory." When the men walked away from the camera, Dale was never seen again. Not a single trace of him has turned up since, besides his truck and belongings that were left at the factory, and the platinum was never discovered either. At one point in the surveillance video, the masked man can be seen wheeling something large out of the plant, but there's no way of knowing if it was Dale's body or not, although some believe it was. To this day, it's unclear whether Dale was a conspirator or a victim in the theft. At the time, he had taken a significant pay cut and was in heaps of debt. But his family believes that his debts were manageable and that Dale wasn't the kind of person to solve his problems through crime. They also don't think he would have voluntarily abandoned his 6 daughters, his son, and his multiple grandchildren. In 2018, over 30 years after Dale's disappearance, his daughter Penny Kerstetter told the Olean Times-Herald that she believes someone knows something about what really happened to her dad. She also thinks her father knew the masked man from the video. She's unsure whether he was working with him or not. At the time, Penny was confident that her father was dead, but was still holding out hope that someone would finally get the truth off their chest and help bring some closure to her grieving family. Number 14. The murder of Liz Barraza. Liz and Sergio Barraza were only days away from a Florida vacation to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary back in 2019. As Sergio left for work one morning, though, Liz, who was 29 years old at the time, set up a yard sale outside the couple's Tomball, Texas home so they could make some extra money before their big trip. Surveillance footage later showed that Sergio had just driven away from the house when an unidentified individual who seemed to be wearing a disguise crept up the driveway toward Mrs. Barraza. In the video, Liz could be heard greeting the person in a friendly manner, which was followed by a brief conversation that lasted no more than 6 seconds. The mysterious figure then suddenly shot the young woman 3 times at point-blank range with a revolver, causing her to immediately collapse. As Liz lay dying on the ground, the killer stood over her and fired one last fatal shot before sprinting from the scene. The footage showed the killer driving away in a Nissan Frontier pickup truck, which was also seen driving around the neighborhood before and after the brutal murder. Police released a video to the public in hopes that someone would come forward with information, but the killer still remains at large. In an interview with local news station KHOU in early 2023, Sergio Barraza said he understands why some people might see him as the prime suspect. After all, the murder victim's spouse usually is the one to blame. But he maintains that he had nothing to do with Liz's death at all and would love to see the case solved for good. In fact, he said it scares him to know that the killer is still out there. He has also never been charged in connection to the murder. Number 13. The kidnapping of Monica de Leon Barba. 29-year-old Monica de Leon Barba was snatched off the street in late 2022 during a walk with her dog in Tepetitlan, Jalisco, Mexico. The incident happened on the night of November 29th, and she hasn't been seen or heard from since. Different parts of the kidnapping were caught on surveillance cameras in the area. In one clip, Monica could be seen stopping briefly on the sidewalk and then disappearing from view. Something or someone was in her way. A few moments later, 3 vehicles suspected of being used in the kidnapping drove by. The FBI identified them as a silver Volkswagen Jetta, a gray Dodge Charger, and a white Chevy Suburban. In the second video clip, multiple suspects could be seen confronting Monica beside their cars. She was forced into the silver Jetta before the convoy drove away. Monica's dog was left to run around in the street. A relative later picked up the poor pup. There are likely 5 male suspects involved, according to the FBI. They were all caught in the video except the driver of the white Suburban. After releasing the footage in 2023, FBI Special Agent in charge Robert K. Tripp said that they believe the kidnapping was targeted and that Monica is still alive and being held hostage. The captors have reportedly been in touch with her family, but details have not been released. There's a $40,000 reward being offered for information that leads to Monica's safe recovery. The FBI urged members of the public to come forward and report anything they believe might help them solve the case. Number 12. Stalker caught red-handed. 64-year-old Debbie Waring-Jones appreciated that her neighbors were willing to feed her cats and water her flowers while she took weekly trips away from her home in Birmingham, England, to Nottingham. She trusted William Nolan and his wife for years, so she was shocked in 2020 when she found listening devices attached to the underside of her coffee table and even the headboard of her bed. In an attempt to identify who put them there, she installed security cameras at her house and waited for someone to come and get the devices. Debbie made her regular trip to Nottingham to see her partner and watched from afar as the cameras captured footage of Nolan picking up the bugs. Before contacting law enforcement, Debbie tried talking to Nolan herself. He claimed he had no idea what she was talking about, so she had her adult son confront him instead. Debbie called the police, and Nolan was arrested for the outrageous breach of privacy. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 1 count of stalking without fear, alarm, or distress and received a measly 15-month jail sentence. During his sentencing, the judge described the case as one of the most serious examples of stalking he had ever seen in his career. The ordeal left Debbie feeling betrayed and scared. She knew Nolan and his wife for over 30 years and thought they were nice, normal, likable people who she could trust. After finding the listening devices, she couldn't shake the fear that her house might still be bugged. She literally lost sleep over the situation. In the aftermath of the case, she made it her mission to educate people on the dangers of stalking. The main lesson she wants to pass along is simply to not trust anyone, even those closest to you. Number 11. The murder of Stephanie Anderson Powell. Just like any other morning one day in 2008, 39-year-old mother of 3 Stephanie Anderson Powell went to work at a Trade Wilco convenience store in Raleigh, North Carolina to work the opening shift. As she approached the front door, a masked robber suddenly rushed up behind her and forced her inside the store at gunpoint. Security cameras caught almost the entire robbery, including Stephanie's pleas to the gunman to spare her life. He repeatedly demanded that Stephanie open the safe, and she tried but couldn't get it to open up. As she desperately scrambled with the lock, she could be heard saying, "Please, Jesus," and begging the thief for her life. The suspect then shot Stephanie, causing her to instantly collapse onto the floor. She could be heard screaming as the robber once again demanded she open the safe. By then, she was too weak to even try. Stephanie's arm could be seen moving in the video, as if in a desperate attempt to reach a cell phone. After grabbing the key to the safe and trying to get it open, the shooter calmly left the store like it was a normal day. Every morning, Stephanie's fiancé, Fred Russell Hewitt, stopped by the store to pick up a newspaper and talk with her. He showed up as usual that day, except this time he found Stephanie lying dead in a pool of blood behind the counter. Heartbreaking security footage captured Hewitt in a hysterical state as he tried to make sense of what he saw and pleaded with 911 operators to quickly get an ambulance to the store. Investigators tied the deadly crime to several recent robberies in the area, but they didn't know who the culprit was. They eventually got hold of a video with a clear view of the killer's face and shared it with the public. A woman identified the suspect as her ex-boyfriend, Armand De Vega, a repeat offender with a long history of burglaries. He was charged with murder and armed robbery in connection to the fatal crime spree. De Vega was convicted of Stephanie's murder as well as 6 counts of robbery. He was sentenced to a life term without parole. Number 10. The abduction of Megan Holden. While living in Tyler, Texas during the early 2000s, 19-year-old Megan Leanne Holden got a part-time job at her local Walmart. Shortly before midnight on January 19, 2005, she clocked out and left the store but never got back home. Megan's remains were found only a few days later in a ditch 380 miles from her workplace. Someone had shot her in the head and left her body like garbage along the side of a road. Chilling surveillance footage of the abduction showed a man in a long black coat rushing up on Megan from behind as she got into her car. The attacker, later identified as a 24-year-old former Marine named Johnny Lee Williams, was seen forcing the woman into the vehicle before getting in himself and driving off. According to witnesses and other evidence, the suspect waited in the parking lot for several hours that night and could even be seen walking after multiple potential victims, as if he was going to kidnap them, before quickly changing his mind. After killing Megan, Williams went on an interstate crime spree while in her car, which included robbing a convenience store and trying to hold up an entire trailer park. The park security had guns and stopped the situation as it happened, causing Williams to flee the scene. Authorities finally caught up with him after he went to a local emergency room to get care for a non-life-threatening gunshot wound. He was promptly sent back to Texas to face charges for Megan's murder. Williams was the only source of information about the circumstances and motives surrounding the abduction, so when attorneys started discussing potential plea deals, the prosecution made it a priority to negotiate an agreement that would involve a detailed confession. In exchange for having the death penalty taken off the table, Williams spent 5 hours going over what he did with Megan's family and law enforcement. According to him, he drove the terrified teenager to his trailer, where he proceeded to assault her and get high. They were at the trailer for about 3 hours before Williams forced Megan back into her vehicle and drove to a hotel in Odessa, where he rented out a room and took advantage of her again. Scared for her life, Megan obeyed her kidnapper's demands. After holding her captive at the hotel for over 8 hours, Williams told Megan that he was going to drive her back to Tyler. She seemed relieved at the time, but became concerned once again during the drive when Williams started going in the opposite direction. In an apparent last-ditch attempt to escape, Megan hit him in the face, but Williams was much larger than her. Megan was rather tiny, and she unfortunately couldn't get away. Williams lost his temper after that and choked Megan until she went limp. He then dragged her out of the car and into a ditch, where she was later found. After shooting her in the head a few times, he left her there. Like a true sociopath, the most compelling thing on his mind was the fact that he was hungry, even though he had just committed such a horrific crime. To satisfy his needs, William drove to a restaurant and ordered a cheeseburger. The prosecutor wanted to seek the death penalty, but it was extremely important to Megan's family to get what details they could about her last few hours on Earth, so the state respected their wishes. Thankfully, Williams will never see freedom beyond bars again. It must have been so difficult for Megan's family to come face to face with her killer and listen as he told them all of the awful things he did to Megan. Number 9. Getting rid of the evidence. Everything seemed fine when 44-year-old Casey Young talked to her family during her drive home from work in May 2015. But nobody ever heard from her after that, and when she didn't show up to her job at a Charleston, South Carolina hospital the next day, her colleagues began to seriously worry about her safety. A missing persons report was quickly filed, and detectives then began to put together the case piece by piece. Phone records revealed that Casey's phone died early the night she vanished, shortly after she got home from work, and had been turned off ever since. Her live-in boyfriend, Daron Collins, told investigators that Casey left during a fight and never came back. Law enforcement soon found out that this was a lie after getting a tip leading them to the location of Casey's car. It was parked outside an apartment building about 3 miles away from the couple's home. Surveillance footage seemed to show Collins leaving the car from the driver's side. He then was seen wiping the car down while wearing gloves and throwing out the cleaning supplies in a nearby dumpster. At the same time, Collins' phone was at the home he and Young shared, leading cops to suspect that he left it there on purpose in order to cover his tracks. A review of the home surveillance system at the house showed that the cameras were unplugged at certain times the day Casey disappeared, and that footage had been deleted. For now, Collins faces charges of obstruction of justice and grand larceny, and he remains a key person of interest in Casey's disappearance. The judge set his bond at $9,000 and is requiring Collins to wear an ankle monitoring bracelet if he ever manages to bond out. The investigation into Casey Young's disappearance is still ongoing, with a reward of up to $10,000 being offered for information leading to the missing woman's location and/or the people responsible. Number 8. The murder of Jermaine Dixon. After serving about 20 years in the federal penitentiary for drug and murder charges, former Patio Crew gang member victim Jermaine Dixon re-entered society in 2020 as a completely new man. He had given up the gang lifestyle entirely and was determined to stay on the straight and narrow path. Less than a year later, though, the 47-year-old was shot in the back of the head in broad daylight and killed while walking to his car in Queens. Surveillance footage caught an African-American man disguised in Hasidic Jewish garb rushing up behind Rita. He then executed the victim in cold blood before speeding off in a car. According to witnesses, the suspect waited in the area for hours leading up to the murder, pretending to work on his car. In 2023, after reviewing surveillance footage and tracing the suspect's movements, police arrested 53-year-old Ron Reeder from Teaneck, New Jersey. Authorities believe the shooting stemmed from the narcotics trade and/or because the victim often carried large amounts of money. On the day he was killed, Dixon had $10,000 in cash on him, but the shooter fled the scene without taking any money. Reeder served 3 years in state prison during the late 1980s for robbery and weapon charges. A few years later, he got a 21-year sentence for manslaughter and weapon charges. He was paroled back in 2012 and now faces charges of second-degree murder and a weapons count. If convicted on the murder charge, Reeder could face life in prison. Number 7. Stalker strikes again. On Christmas Eve 2016, a young woman from Union County, North Carolina, named Maddie Mulstaff, was terrified when her doorbell camera revealed that one of her high school classmates, Logan Orsini, was outside waiting on her porch. He asked if he could speak with Maddie, but she was too creeped out to entertain the man. The two teens weren't even friends. In fact, they barely knew each other at all, so Logan had no reason whatsoever to be at her house. The next morning, Maddie woke up and found a bizarre shrine dedicated to her on the front porch. There were also several religious items, including a Bible opened up to the story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, sandals, a bottle of wine, and an alabaster jar, which Mary used in a biblical story to pour oils on Jesus' feet. This was just the first of what would become many unwelcome surprise visits. On one occasion, Logan hung out on Maddie's porch for hours in the middle of the night. He paced back and forth and talked to himself as he did so. Over the years, he's been charged with stalking countless times for repeatedly contacting Maddie. He was warned to leave her alone, but it apparently didn't sink in. The judge overseeing the case spared Logan of any prison time for the first 3 stalking charges and sentenced him to only 5 years of probation. He warned the man that if he violated his probation, he would most likely get locked up for a long time. As you've probably already guessed, Logan violated the order. He was taken back into custody in 2018, but was freed after posting a $30,000 bond. In 2019, sheriff's deputies arrested him for standing across the street from the Mulstaff family's home. He also caught another stalking charge for harassing Maddie's boyfriend. This time he was held on a $130,000 bond. The young woman later told Inside Edition that she had gotten used to never feeling safe, since her stalker had practically managed to avoid jail entirely. She began speaking out to lawmakers about the need for heightened protection for the victims of stalking. With the system currently in place, Maddie has to renew her order of protection against Logan every year, which also means being forced to face her stalker in court each time. She has called for legal changes that would allow restraining orders to be valid for longer periods than 1 year at a time. Speaking with Fox 46, Maddie's dad described Logan as having a God complex. He said that all the family wanted was for him to leave his daughter alone. They didn't and still don't understand the man's obsession with her, and they wished he would get serious mental help. Number 6. The murder of Missyvers. Early one morning in 2016, 45-year-old fitness instructor and mother of 3, Terry Missyvers, went to her church in Midlothian, Texas to set up for an exercise class she was supposed to teach. When her students came in about an hour later, around 5 a.m., they found Missy lifeless on the floor. She had been viciously attacked, leaving her with a major head injury and multiple puncture wounds in the chest. First responders tried their best to save the woman, but she succumbed to her injuries. While checking the building's surveillance cameras, police found footage of a masked person wandering around in riot gear and a vest that said police on it. The individual could be seen pushing doors open, as if they were searching for someone. Almost everything about the murder is still a mystery to this day. Nothing seemed to be stolen from either the church or from Missy, ruling out the likelihood of a robbery gone wrong. And while the shooting seemed specifically targeted, Missy was a well-liked person with no enemies that anyone could think of. Her friends and family also failed to come up with a possible reason someone might want her dead. Just days before she was killed, she showed a friend some creepy messages she got from a man on LinkedIn, and in the months leading up to the shooting, she had exchanged flirtatious messages on the same website with another person. Naturally, investigators also initially looked at Missy's husband, Brandon, as a potential suspect. He claimed that their marriage was going great, but it sure didn't look that way to detectives after seeing the couple's financial records and talking to people who knew them. In fact, it seemed like Brandon and Missy were heading toward a divorce thanks to infidelity and fighting. Brandon has denied any involvement in Missy's death since her passing and has never been charged in connection to the case. While many people seem to have made their mind up about him playing some kind of role in the murder, that's not the case as far as anyone knows, and he's presumed innocent under the law. Authorities are unsure of the killer's gender and have only narrowed the suspect's height down to somewhere between 5 feet 2 inches and 5 foot 8. The person walked with a distinctive limp, which so far has only been useful for ruling people out. As the case sits at a standstill, even after receiving help from the FBI, authorities remain hopeful that someone will come forward with information that will help solve the case and ensure that justice is served once and for all. Number 5. Disappearance of Tiffany Whitton. It was no secret that 26-year-old Tiffany Whitton was not a model citizen. Addicted to both heroin and meth, she had a nasty habit of stealing to support her addictions because she struggled to hold long-term employment. In August 2013, a surveillance camera captured footage of her stealing from an IHOP in Georgia that she worked at. Between stealing and showing up to her shifts high, she was unable to keep up with the job and was eventually fired. A little over a month later, Tiffany was seen acting strange during a late-night, early-morning trip to a Walmart in Marietta, Georgia. After seeing her shoplift, security guards tried to confront her and search through her purse. Tiffany then dropped her bag and phone, kicked her shoes off, and ran from the store on foot, even though the guards never chased after her. She was never seen or heard from again. Tiffany's boyfriend, Ashley Cordell, was with her that night. The couple had taken some drugs and they had a small fight at the store. When Tiffany fled from the store, Cordell didn't immediately follow her out. About an hour after she ran away, he showed up at the IHOP she had gotten fired from and asked if anyone had seen her there. Cordell failed to tell the young woman's family that she had vanished into thin air at 2 o'clock in the morning, and because Tiffany had a habit of disappearing for days at a time, her family didn't immediately suspect that she might be in a dangerous situation. But they eventually started to worry and got the police involved. During questioning, Cordell's version of events seemed confusing and conflicting, but he consistently stood by one thing: he didn't have anything to do with Tiffany's disappearance. Without any evidence of Tiffany's whereabouts or fate, it's impossible to say what happened to her or who, if anyone, is even responsible for it. Number 4. The murder of Tushar Atri. 50-year-old tech entrepreneur, marijuana executive Tushar Atri lived in a multi-million-dollar seaside home in Santa Cruz, California. But what seemed to many like a dream quickly turned into a nightmare in October 2019, when he was kidnapped and murdered near his house. A neighbor's surveillance camera captured footage of 3 people walking toward Atri's house shortly before 3 o'clock in the morning. Several of Atri's live-in employees overheard the criminals entering the house and talking about some kind of safe. They could also hear Atri's voice as the men captured him. The suspects were most likely referring to a safe in Atri's bedroom, which held about $80,000 cash in it. The intruders left without getting it open, and the employees quickly called the police. There were no signs of forced entry, and the home had not been ransacked at all. But Atri was still missing, along with a BMW belonging to his girlfriend, who was out of town at the time, and there was a large amount of blood in the street. Security footage later showed Atri trying to run from his house with his hands tied up behind him while being chased and tackled by the suspects. At least one of the men was carrying an assault rifle. The kidnappers then forced Atri into the BMW, and drove off. Several hours later, police found a vehicle abandoned near Atri's cannabis farm in the mountains. There was blood on both the interior and exterior. About 60 feet from the SUV, investigators found Atri's dead body. He was face down and handcuffed with zip ties behind his back. He had multiple stab wounds and a gunshot wound. Months went by without any major leads. This quickly soon turned to years. In one sense, there were plenty of suspects based on the fact that Atri had so much money. At the same time, everyone the investigators looked at kept getting ruled out as suspects. But detectives continued working on the case, and in 2023 they finally arrested 4 people: Stephen Lindsay, Joshua Camps, Curtis Charters, and Caleb Charters. Stephen Lindsay and Caleb Charters were former employees of Atri's who had only worked for him for a short time. They were allegedly unhappy over a money-related matter and felt that Atri owed them. They also felt emasculated after being ordered to do push-ups in front of fellow employees. All 4 men have pleaded not guilty to murder, kidnapping, and robbery. The case is still being carried out through court. Number 3. The disappearance of Stephen Katsi. A Florida attorney named Stephen Katsi told his colleagues he was going to the bathroom one day back in 2023. Instead, he vanished from the law practice in Largo, Florida, and never came back, leaving his keys, wallet, and phone on his desk and a partially written email on his computer. Concerned for his safety, his best friend and managing partner, Jake Blanchard, filed a missing persons report as soon as he could. The bathroom of the building was smeared with blood and smelled strongly of bleach, as if someone had tried to clean up evidence. Surveillance footage showed a Toyota Tundra pulling into the parking lot that morning around 8:30 a.m. or so. A man identified by authorities as a plastic surgeon named Dr. Tomasz Kozowski could then be seen getting out of the vehicle and carrying a large box into the building. He was wearing gloves and had a backpack with him. Almost 2 hours later, after Katsi took his bathroom break, the man thought to be Kozowski left the building wearing a different outfit than the one he went inside with. He was pulling a cart with a covering hiding its contents and was visibly struggling with what seemed like dead human weight. A search of Kozowski's vehicles turned up a ballistic vest covered in blood, a taser, brass knuckles, duct tape, masks, IV needles, and even sedatives. Based on the amount of blood found, along with the fact that Katsi was never seen physically leaving the building, investigators believe Kozowski killed him and wheeled his body out. He's currently in custody on suspicion of first-degree murder. It's rare for prosecutors to pursue a murder case without a body being found, especially so early on in an investigation. Kozowski's lawyer urged the public to remember that every defendant is presumed innocent until found guilty. According to NBC Miami, the law firm Katsi worked for was representing Kozowski's former boss and co-workers in a lawsuit filed by Kozowski. He accused the company and its staff of improperly billing his patients while he worked there and claimed that the mismanagement damaged his reputation and career potential. Authorities have declined to speculate about a possible motive for the time being. Number 2. The murder of Mary Lou Sarkissian. The relationship between 50-year-old mother of 3, Mary Lou Sarkissian, and her on- and off-boyfriend of 5 years, Jason Besher, became more toxic every time they fought to try making things work. In 2016, Mary Lou finally decided to cut things off for good. By then, the relationship had taken a violent turn, and she was genuinely afraid of her former lover. She decided to get a 5-year restraining order against Besher, but it failed to keep her ex-boyfriend away. Besher was convinced that Mary Lou was holding out some of the profits from his illegal marijuana growing operation. One day he showed up at her home and allegedly tried to choke her with a towel. As she made it clear to him that their relationship was over, he only seemed more intent on refusing to accept the reality of their situation. He went from begging for Mary Lou back to aggressively harassing her into accepting him. After finally disentangling herself from Besher, Mary Lou blocked him and had security cameras installed at her home in Huntington Beach, California. The next day, her family became worried since they hadn't heard from her in a while. Meanwhile, Besher confided in a relative about a horrific act he committed the night before. At the family member's request, he turned himself in to the police. Mary Lou was discovered dead on her floor in a pool of blood. Based on the evidence at the scene, investigators concluded that Besher tried to break in with a crowbar. When it didn't work, he waited outside her sliding glass bedroom door, knowing she would let her dog outside at some point. He then slipped inside at the first opportunity and violently beat and strangled the victim. While reviewing the footage from Mary Lou's security system, detectives heard Besher sarcastically saying, "New security system, how did that effing work out for you?" He was soon charged with murder. During his trial, the court heard about how Mary Lou had indeed somehow spent a lot more money than she made on paper. It will never be known whether or not she stole it from Besher's marijuana operation or if they had an agreement as business partners. But it doesn't matter because either way, it wouldn't have justified her murder. Besher's defense team argued that he didn't mean to kill Mary Lou and that he wouldn't have turned himself in if he actually had. All he meant to do that night was collect money that Mary Lou owed him, but he lost control. They also mentioned a few things from his childhood that they claimed affected his behavior as an adult. Consequently, the defense urged the court to sentence the defendant to the lesser charge of second-degree murder or manslaughter. Prosecutors accused Besher of lying in wait, though, and deliberately killing Mary Lou in a premeditated crime. The jury decided to convict him of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of lying in wait, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 1. Creepy Canadian Air Force Colonel. As a high-ranking officer for the Canadian Air Force, Russell Williams was a shining pillar of his community. He was highly educated, had a top security clearance, and at one point was responsible for transporting British royalty during their visits to Canada. In 2008, Williams started to act on some of his most intimate desires. But instead of doing it legally, he began breaking into random houses to fulfill his disturbing fetish for women's underwear. Nobody in the small Ontario town where he lived knew who the mysterious thief was, but it happened often enough for people to get used to having their entire collection of undergarments disappear. During his break-ins, Williams sometimes stuck around long enough to try things on and take pictures of himself wearing the stolen items with his camera. He also did this at home, where he kept his growing collection catalogued. On at least 2 different occasions, he burned the garments in his possession because he was accumulating way too many to successfully hide them from his wife. Williams escalated his disturbing behavior back in 2009 when he violently assaulted 2 women inside their homes. A few months later, he killed fellow Air Force members, Corporal Marie-France Comeau. In 2010, Williams killed a 27-year-old single mom named Jessica Lloyd. Unable to find her body, law enforcement officials classified her as a missing person while they tried to explain the alarming increase in violent crime in their area. Until then, nobody had even thought to suspect Williams of being responsible for the crimes. In fact, another neighbor had actually fallen under suspicion, and although he was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, his reputation took a huge hit. Investigators finally tied the crimes to Williams through some tire treads that were left behind at the scene of Jessica Lloyd's murder. The pattern of treads was from a highly unusual make of tire, and it matched up perfectly with Williams' Pathfinder. He was summoned to the police station for questioning and started confessing later that day after being presented with the tire tread evidence. He also began to open up after realizing there was no talking his way out of the problems he had created for himself. By owning up to his actions, the disgraced former commander believed it would make the situation easier on his wife, who reportedly knew nothing at all of his many crimes. While giving his confession, he admitted that he took Lloyd's life because she had seen his face and knew he was the one who was breaking into homes. He revealed the location of her body and told investigators where they could find more evidence at his house. While searching through his electronic devices, detectives came across thousands of photos of Williams wearing stolen undergarments. He was hit with too many criminal charges to list here. He went from being one of the Canadian military's most respected leaders ever to its biggest disgrace literally overnight. The case received worldwide coverage and outrage. The man pleaded guilty to nearly 90 counts, including Lloyd's murder, Comeau's murder, breaking and entering, forcible confinement, breaking and entering, assault, and much more. He received 2 life sentences, an 82-year sentence, and 4 10-year sentences which are running concurrently. While he could technically be paroled after serving just 25 years, a prosecutor said it will be very difficult considering the brutal nature of his crimes. The Canadian Air Force made a statement of disapproval by burning Williams' uniform, cutting up his medals, and crushing his vehicle when a verdict was reached. Thanks for watching. Would you rather find out you were being spied on with a listening device or that you were being secretly recorded through a soundless camera? Why would you prefer one over the other? Let us know in the comments below. We'll see you next time.